Welcome back with my review of the new Paul McCartney album, The Boys of Dungeon Lane, was released today. First of all, it's great. Was a bit worried when, it became clear that Andrew Watt is the producer. For example, the last Rolling Stones album, Hackneyed Diamonds, and also his biography in general, suggested to me that Paul will, go on this path of trying to sound young and modern and relevant and very pop, which he did on Egypt Station, the last real album, if we don't count McCartney 3. I liked Egypt Station, I once ranked the whole discography of Paul McCartney, and I think Egypt Station was like number 13 or 14 out of 30 records, and one of my favorite albums of his of the 21st century. But the direction he took in terms of sound and aesthetic, that was maybe the one gripe I had with Egypt Station, and I thought, okay, he's going even further into this direction now. But those worries were unwarranted. He doesn't try to sound modern or too modern on his album. He also doesn't actively try to sound retro, which would be the other extreme that I wouldn't really like him to be, because Paul McCartney was always about being adventurous and being, searching for new sounds. So that aspect is okay, but I don't want it to be too much on the nose. I want it to be like a natural progression of his sound, and this album is exactly that. So it has a more vintage and therefore also more timeless sound than Egypt Station. Reminds me a bit of the aesthetic of albums like Chaos and Creation in the Backyard and Flaming Pie, which of the albums from the last 30 years he did are the two albums that I even prefer to Egypt Station. Two stone cold classics in my opinion. And I'm saying it out loud now. I think The Boys of Dungeon Lane will be also regarded as one of those stone cold modern day Paul McCartney classics. It's up there with Flaming Pie and Chaos and Creation in my opinion, which is totally unexpected for me because of his age. Let's be real. It won't get easier. The older you get, it won't get easier to put out brilliantly written and also sung and performed pop albums. But yeah, he did it, and also, therefore also Andrew Watt has to be, you have to tip your hat to Andrew Watt. What he did there with Paul, I think he also has some co-writes with Paul on this album, and again, not knowing those songs, if you just read the news, he co-wrote some songs with Paul, it would immediately, I would immediately be like, that's not a good sign. But it turned out very nicely. It's really a great album. Like I said, it has like the best aspects of Egypt Station, the adventurous, the explorer Paul, but at the same time it's not as shallow or superficial as in places it sounded on Egypt Station, this kind of youthful exploration spirit, because he balances it out with this, like I said, more vintage, more timeless approach, and so the album has a really good mood and good variation, so it's not the one extreme and not the other extreme. It's not as dour and as somber as Chaos and Creation, which I really love. I'm a big fan of that album. But if you want to have more eclecticism, Chaos wasn't really your album for the eclectic Paul, but this album is. So it has the great aspect, the personal lyrics, the soul-searching lyrics, and the grown-up atmosphere of Chaos and Creation, but mixed with with that poppy exploratory vibe it's also important to Paul McCartney. There's a couple of things on this album that he hadn't done before. At 83 he still there's still place for some first time things in Paul McCartney's career, like spoken word passages. I mean, in Talk More Talk from Press to Play, which is the album I hate most by Paul McCartney, it's my most disliked Paul McCartney album except Kisses on the Bottom. Talk More Talk also has kind of spoken word, but As You Lie, the opener of the album, and now I think we can go to the track by track analysis of the album. There's a spoken word section in that song. It even begins, more or less it begins, the whole album begins with a first for Paul McCartney, which is really like a sign at the beginning, a signpost, signaling I'm still exploring new stuff. But then, it turns into a classic Paul McCartney rock song. It begins with acoustic guitar and the spoken word thing. And, in the beginning you think of something like, is he now doing a Travis Cocker impersonation? Because also the song is very a Travis Cocker kind of subject, from the mid-90s Travis Cocker songs like I Spy or Disco 2000, where he's like desiring a woman that, that he doesn't get in the end. But it's done very tasteful. It's not as creepy as it sounds now. And like I said, it turns into a really great rocker. This album also, I think, has his best rockers since at least Memory Almost Full. Rock songs and Paul McCartney, after Memory Almost Full, there's always one or two on most of the albums, but mostly they are like the low points of these albums, especially because of his deteriorated voice. But Andrew Watts somehow really disguised the weak points of the rock and roll voice very nicely. But I don't think there's any AI, at least that I can sense, at work here. If there's AI done to Paul's voice, which I kind of doubt, it's done very subtly and tastefully. He really sounds good for the most part. He sounds like his age, but in a good way, Lost Horizon is the next song. I think that's also a mid-tempo rock song, and that's probably my least favorite song of the album. Interestingly, in interviews, Paul said that this was, a leftover from many, many years, maybe even decades ago, a song that he forgotten that he written it, and then, he found it again. I think he should have kept it forgotten. I think it's the least interesting song on the album. Reminds a bit of the lesser songs on Flaming Pie, which were also like the rock songs, the mid-tempo rock songs on Flaming Pie. It's a bit of a dead rock song, I'm afraid. Lyrics are good, and the lyrics are good for the most part on this album. It's, again, that's also harking back to Chaos and Creation, that it has those mature, meaningful lyrics. It doesn't really silly Paul McCartney at work here in the lyric department of this album, and that's especially apparent on the next track, which was the lead-off single of the album, The Days We Left Behind. Clear highlight, maybe the big highlight of the album. It gets better and better with each listen. I would say it's already, at least in my book, a Stone Cold McCartney classic. It's he attempted something like that on the new album with Early Days, but The Days We Left Behind is so much better, and it's up there with his best sentimental ballads, and that is saying a lot. Paul McCartney is the master of the sentimental ballad in a way, and there's also a theme. Some people, including Paul, would make you believe this is kind of a concept album about him nostalgically looking back at his life. And in many aspects, that's true. I think at least 60% at least, maybe 2/3 of the album's lyrics are reflective Paul looking back at his life. And interestingly, there's kind of unofficially a song dedicated to each Beatle, or the memory of each Beatle. Days We Left Behind is clearly the John song. Then we have Down South, which is the George song, thinking about George and him hitchhiking to Wales in the late 50s. And then of course there's Home to Us, which is Paul and Ringo sharing their memories of growing up in Liverpool. But next song, after the big highlight of Days We Left Behind, is Ripples in a Pond. Wonderful melody, nice pop song. And like I said, on Egypt Station and Also New, he tried to have some effortless sounding, modern sounding pop songs, and it didn't really work often. but this time it works, and Rippers in a Pond is an example of that. You know, it's also kind of like a 2026 version of one of the more adventurous pop songs from Pipes of Peace era Paul, like Keep Undercover. It's short, it's sweet, but still complex, you know, it's still great composition and arrangement. Mountaintop was referenced before the album came out as the big stomping psychedelic rocker of the album. And it kind of is, but at the same time it isn't really. It's definitely a song influenced by psychedelic experiences, you know, magic mushrooms are getting mentioned in the lyrics, and tripping and things like that. I expected a bit more of, you know, like a psychedelic wild beast of a song because of what people were saying in advance, but it's still, you know, it's a nice trippy song. The outro bit is especially awesome, you know, at the end, and wouldn't have been totally out of place on Electric Arguments, you know, that great Fireman album he did in 2008, I think, with the producer Youth, which had lots of great songs or jams in that style. Next one, I already mentioned it briefly, Down South, the ballad dedicated to you know, his memories with George when they were hitchhiking to Wales. Sweet and short, like most of the songs on this album. You know, this album really knows when a song is over and doesn't, you know, often something that Paul didn't manage brilliantly on previous efforts. You know, sometimes he doesn't really know how to end a song. On this album, you know, the songs have all the right length, and he knows when it's time to finish the song. You know, that nice little acoustic guitar solo at the end of the song makes me dream what would have been a fully instrumented and fully arranged pop song version of this, like, you know, a full band song. I think it would have been a great full band song. I'm sure they must have tried a version like that because the song is written like something like that, but for some reason I guess they abandoned it and went with the acoustic ballad approach, which is also fine, of course. Then We Too, it reminds me of a different song, but I can't think, not by him, by a different artist, but I can't think of which. A simple, no-nonsense production that really gets to the core of it, no fluff, you know, a love song that isn't soppy or schmaltzy. And like many songs on this album, it almost feels like a demo, but like a good demo, like a great demo. Come Inside, maybe my favorite track of the album, except The Days We Left Behind. You know, this is a really solid, or more than solid, pop rocker. Sounds like a 90s Britpop song by Oasis or Suede or something like that. Reminds me slightly on The World Tonight, but I very much prefer to The World Tonight, which was never a favorite song of mine. Again, great rock singing for his age again. And again, in general, I think the singing is better on this album than in decades. Never Know is a very interesting song. That's one of those songs that needs to unfold. You have to listen to it repeatedly. And again, one of the more psychedelic songs. Maybe even more psychedelic than Mountaintop, where everyone was going on about how psychedelic it sounds. But this, you know, this song has the Strawberry Fields mellotron. It has, you know, recorders of flutes, you know, Fool on the Hill vibes. So it's a bit like Magical Mystery Tour era Paul. But yet at the same time, it doesn't sound like anything he has done before. So it's looking back and nostalgic and retro, but adventurous in the best way as well. You know, very unique sounding, and could have been on McCartney too in a way. Then Home to Us, the catchy, funny little pop sing-along with Ringo. Sounds a lot like Electric Light Orchestra, especially when ELO are trying to sound like the Beatles. And that itself gives it, you know, Flaming Pie vibes, which was co-produced by Jeff Lynne. I like it. I suspect he wrote it initially for Ringo, you know, for a Ringo album, to give it to Ringo, but then in the end, you know, thought, oh, it's probably too good to give it to Ringo. I make it a song that I sing with Ringo on my album, and, you know, it's a great song. Life Can Be Hard, it's a bittersweet, beautiful love song with a subtle string arrangement, sounds very delicate and breezy. You know, the opposite of an overblown, saccharine 80s mecca power ballad, you know, something, you know, before he became this elder statesman, you know, in the 21st century, you know, the image of Paul McCartney in the 90s and 80s wasn't the best, and, you know, he was often seen as, you know, as someone who makes those epic schmaltzy power ballads. And in recent years, he really learned to, you know, to pull back and be more down to earth with his love songs. And this is a great example of him doing it the subtle way. That's how an elder statesman, you know, writes a love song in his 80s. First Star of the Night, again, very subtle, delicate, wonderful, jazzy acoustic song. In general, I would say, except Kisses on the Bottom, which was a covers album and an album I don't care for. In general, I would say this is his most jazzy album ever. So that's also something that's very, you know, like going for a tasteful, age-appropriate approach, but not giving up the adventurous rock and pop energy, like I said. But First Star of the Night doesn't really have a pop or rock aura. It's really you know, a song in the vein of a certain softness or distractions. Also a bit of Till There Was You, which was his first, you know, flirting with a jazzy arrangement. You know, when the Beatles covered this song for With the Beatles. You know, on paper this song should be a filler, at least for someone like me, but it's too good for that. So, you know, even the track that would be the archetypical filler on a McCartney album isn't a filler to me. That's how good I think this album is. Then Salesman Saint, one of those memories from youth songs, you know, the loose concept of the album, talking about his parents, has a kind of a surprising Johnny Cash vibe, you know, with its laconic tone. Then the trumpet, if it's a trumpet or trumpets, maybe a reminiscence of his father, you know, who was in jazz bands in the 20s and 30s. And also the first instrument his father gave to Paul famously was a trumpet. So that's very nice, you know, to have this in there. And it also sounds great, you know, again, very jazzy feel. He often in the past had those old-timey songs reminiscent of the music of his parents' generation, but usually they were, you know, mostly tongue-in-cheek pastiches like Venom 64, Honey Pie, Baby's Request. But this, you know, on this album, songs like this feel sincere and therefore have like a cool jazzy vibe to them and aren't like not taking it totally serious. So this is also a progression, you know, one of those things where this album shows a new progressed Paul McCartney. And then the last song, Momma Gets By, you know, one would easily be led to believe that this is also one of those autobiographical songs, but it really isn't, you know. He always says that his family, you know, there was lots of warmth and everyone was sticking together. And this is more a song about a father who's not really there for the family. But I think it's also kind of autobiographical because it's a storytelling song about an upbringing in a working class background, and I'm sure he when he was a child he had lots of mates who had kind of an upbringing like that. So I think it also plays into the loose concept of the album. Again, a classy arrangement, wonderful flute, strings, brass and acoustic guitar flourishes, a wonderful way to finish the album. So all in all, this is unexpectedly great. And like I said in the beginning, I once ranked the whole discography of Paul McCartney, which were 30 albums, so this would be the 31st album. And I would say if I'd had to rank it, it would be somewhere between 11 and 15, maybe 12, maybe my 12th or 13th favorite McCartney album of all time. And you know, who would expect this, you know, from an album in this late stage of his career? I think three great McCartney albums that you could compare it with would be Tug of War, Flaming Pie and Chaos and Creation in the Backyard. You know, what all these albums have in common, and also in common with this album, is that they are very consistent albums without any real stinkers. You know, Paul McCartney often has one or two stinkers on even good McCartney albums, But these 3 albums plus this, so Tug of War, Flaming Pie, Chaos and Creation, and The Boys of Dungeon Lane, are those rare examples of very consistent Paul McCartney albums without any lackluster tracks, and you can really feel that a lot of care and love has been given to the material by Andrew Watt and Paul McCartney. So fantastic album. 2026 in general, I think, is a good year for new music, also by young artists, but also by the old ones. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, goodbye.